Hello and welcome to a quick revision session recapping how you should structure your answers in GCSE History Paper 1 for AQA. We're going to be focusing on America 1920 to 1973 and the Conflict and Tension Unit 1919 to 1939, which we also call Causes of World War II. So in this paper you're actually going to get given two booklets. One will be your America 1920 to 73 booklet, and one will be your Conflict and Tension booklet, and you're looking for 1919 to 1939, which is Causes of World War II. Each booklet will contain a selection of different questions. The America booklet will have 6 questions, although actually the first 3 questions are all linked together and they're one big question really. And the Conflict and Tension side, or Causes of World War II, just has 4 questions in it. You're advised to spend 50 minutes on each of the booklets. No one's going to remind you that you need to change onto your second booklet, so you need to make sure when you sit down in the exam hall, before you start writing, you have a good look at the clock and you make a note. For example, if it is 9 o'clock when you start your exam, then 50 minutes in is going to be 10 to 10. So keep an eye on the clock, and when it reaches 10 to 10, make sure you move on to the second paper. So let's start by doing a quick recap of how to answer the questions in the America booklet of your paper. So like previously mentioned, questions 1, 2 and 3 on the America booklet will all be about the same thing. How interpretations differ, why the 2 interpretations differ, and which of the 2 interpretations is the most convincing. Spend a couple of minutes reading through each of the interpretations and then make a start on these 3 questions. Question 1 is only worth 4 marks. How do the interpretations differ? So for this one, you're going to quote something that the interpretation says, explain what it means. Quote the second interpretation and explain how that meaning is different. So for example, perhaps interpretation 1 says something was a really fantastic idea, like the New Deal, and the second one says it's a really terrible idea. Or perhaps one might say that the boom affected everyone positively, and the second might be suggesting that actually not everyone benefited in the same way. Could be something else. Could be anything at all, but you're looking for some kind of difference in what they're saying. In question 2, it's the same 2 interpretations you've already read, but this time you're going to say why they are different. And that's the important difference between question 1 and question 2. Question 1, you're just saying what is different about what they're saying, so one is positive, one is negative, that kind of thing. Whereas question 2, you're going to explain the reason that they have different opinions. For this, there are 3 things you could consider, and I usually think of padding the source, a bit like padding pause. So, pad the source. Purpose, author, date. Why was this interpretation created? Was it for a government who's trying to make themselves look good in America? Was it to try and persuade people to change something? Was it a personal diary entry? Author. Who created it? How would they personally have been affected by this event? For example, if we're talking the boom in the 1920s, is it a factory worker who would have been working incredibly long hours for very little pay? Or perhaps it's a factory owner like Henry Ford, and therefore he's making millions of dollars a year. The date of a source is also important, or the interpretation even. Perhaps it's a long time ago and people don't remember exactly what it was like anymore, or perhaps there's recently been some kind of big change and therefore that might explain the views changing. Perhaps both sources are written, for example, by an African American, but one is before the Jim Crow laws have been got rid of and one is afterwards. So their opinions of things might have changed, perhaps things have improved. So look out for those 3 things to be able to explain why the interpretations are different. Usually I would go for some sort of sentence starter like this. Interpretation A, or 1, or whatever it's called, was written for whatever purpose, or written to, what was it to do, or by which author. Therefore, it would be more likely to say positive things or negative things because, so for example, if we're talking perhaps a woman in the 1970s, after 1973, she might be really positive about experiences for women, perhaps because they now had access to abortion legally because those reforms have been passed, whereas maybe previously there might be a woman who was saying that there were more problems. And I would say, okay, well, interpretation A was written in 1973, therefore it'd be more likely to say positive things because I know that, and I'm using a piece of my own knowledge to back it up, reforms have been put in place to enable women to access abortion for the first time. Interpretation B was written for or by or to, therefore it would be more likely to say something positive or negative because. So it's just a couple of sentences, but you must make sure you briefly use a piece of own knowledge for both interpretation A and interpretation B. Then the last of these three questions that you're answering on this paper are which interpretation is most convincing for 8 marks. 8 marks, 2 paragraphs. So make sure you write 1 paragraph on interpretation A and use 2 or 3 bits of your own knowledge to say how accurate you think interpretation A is. Convincing means accurate. So interpretation A is really convincing because I know that at this time women face this problem, that problem, the other problem, and therefore overall my judgment about how convincing it is that it's very convincing or not very convincing. And then interpretation B, exactly the same thing. Use 2 or 3 bits of your own knowledge to explain why you think what it says is accurate or not accurate. And then you need a conclusion, a few sentences at the bottom. Overall, what's your judgment? Why is one of these less convincing than the other? Question 4 is a fantastically easy question. So it's just going to ask you to describe 2 problems caused by something. 4 marks. 4 marks, 4 minutes maximum. You're going to say a problem and explain why that thing was a problem. So for example, with prohibition, you might say one problem was that it was difficult to enforce. The reason why this was the case is because America is such a large country with vast different borders that it's very difficult to control, and they only ever had about 3,000 enforcement officers put in place. Obviously, make sure you write about 2 problems, so a problem and why that thing existed as a problem. Question 5 is going to ask you to explain how something changed in America. You're going to say what the change was, why this change happened, and the consequences of that change. So for example, you might say that African Americans gained more rights in the 1960s, and this happened as a result of the NAACP, and it was because, and you're going to give a few details, so things like perhaps the Rosa Parks bus boycott and the fact that it happens for nearly a year, and that about 70% of the people using the buses in Montgomery were African Americans, and because they were all refusing to use the buses, there's pressure from the bus companies to try and change the segregated system on the buses. And the consequence of this action was that they repealed the segregation laws on buses in that state, and therefore people had slightly greater rights than before. A second change that African Americans saw in the 1960s was, etc. So you just do 2 paragraphs, a change, why that change happened, a couple of key details, and a consequence of that change. You might particularly want to consider with the consequences if you're aiming for grade 7 to 9 if there were any limitations. Does it affect all states or only some? Final question on this side of the paper is the 16-mark question. And this one is quite important because it's worth most of the marks on the paper. You're going to be asked which had a more significant impact, X or Y, and there's 2 bullet points. All you have to do is have an argument running through your answer. So, state which had more significant impact in your introduction. So just write a sentence saying World War II had a more significant impact than the New Deal, or whatever else you're going to choose. Then paragraph 1 should be about the first factor and how that had an impact. Give 2 or 3 specific examples. At the end, link back to the question. What we mean by a link, which I think sometimes people don't understand, is what have you proved in this paragraph? So what have you proved about which is more significant? Have you proved that X was really, really significant, had a massive impact on everyone's lives? Or have we proved that actually X only impacted a few groups of people or didn't have any impact at all? So give 2 or 3 specific examples and end your paragraph by stating what you have proved. Do the same for your second bullet point, and it's very important you do both of the bullet points, otherwise you won't get very many marks. And then end with a conclusion. Overall, which had a more significant impact, and why was the other bullet point less significant? 50 minutes is now up, so you need to be moving on to your second paper. Booklet 2 is going to be conflict and tension. Question 1 is a lovely gift of a question. It says, source A opposes something. How do you know? 4 marks. 4 marks, 4 minutes maximum. So this is a nice question. You just quote something the source says or shows, you explain its meaning, and you back it up with a piece of your own knowledge. So for example, if the source says perhaps source A opposes the Treaty of Versailles, how do you know? You might quote something it says about the fines being too big, or perhaps the picture shows, the very famous one, for example, where Clemenceau is shown as a vampire sucking the life out of Germany. You explain the meaning. So it means that Germany wasn't able to cope, or it means that people were unhappy with the fines that were imposed, they thought they were too much, or whatever else it might be suggesting. Back it up with your own knowledge. I know that this was the case because they charged them 6.6 billion marks in fines, etc. So, quote something in the source, explain its meaning, as in what is it saying that's opposing whatever it happens to be, and back it up using a piece of your own knowledge. Only very brief though, because it's only 4 marks, 4 minutes. Question 2 is also not so bad. It's a source question, so it's going to say study sources B and C. Very important that you notice this. It is not source A and B, but sources B and C. Make sure you're using 2 correct sources. How useful are these sources to a historian studying? And they'll give you a topic. 12 marks, so a considerable question. Here, the top tip is superhero the sources or caped them. So, content, accuracy, person writing it, do they have any reason to exaggerate, and does the date have any impact on reliability? So for example, if the question was how useful are these sources to a historian studying the League of Nations, then perhaps you might be looking, okay, well, what does it suggest about the League of Nations? Perhaps it's showing that the key members of the League of Nations weren't really fully committed to it. How accurate was it? Oh, very accurate. Perhaps it might mention something about America. We know that America never joined the League of Nations, even though it was actually their idea and they were following a policy of isolationism. Or perhaps you might use a bit of your own knowledge about Britain and France being involved in a secret pact with Italy, allowing them to invade Abyssinia. The person who is writing the source, does this person have any reason to exaggerate? Or does the date explain anything? So, for example, is this a year that we had the Manchurian crisis, or is it the year that Abyssinia was invaded, etc.? And think about this really carefully. Make sure you're thinking about how reliable the person is who is writing the source as well. If you write about all these things, if you caped each source, so paragraph 1, talk about the first source, source B, and content accuracy. Do they have any reason to lie or exaggerate? How reliable are they? Do that with the second source, and then you're going to do a conclusion. Overall, how useful are C and D for a historian studying this topic? Is one more useful than the other, or are they equally useful? Is one limited, or perhaps both very limited in use, and why? So sort of draw to a conclusion a couple of sentences. How useful are those 2 sources? Almost there. Last 2 questions of the paper. Question 3. Write an account of how such and such a thing happened. So you talk about an event, what were the consequences of the event, and long term, what was the effect of this? So for example, write an account of how Hitler was able to achieve Anschluss. You might talk about an early event, the fact that the Nazis had gone into Austria and they had murdered, unofficially obviously, the Austrian Chancellor. The consequence of that event was people were panicking. The fact that they were desperate for a new leader to be taking over, that the new Chancellor was perhaps, as a long-term effect, more willing to work with the Nazis. He was worried about if he didn't please the Nazis in Austria, then perhaps the same thing might happen to him, and it made it easier, therefore, for Nazis to gain key positions of power in Austria before the invasion occurred. Then you go on with a second paragraph, another event, another consequence, another long-term effect. Make sure you use 2 or 3 bits of your own knowledge in each paragraph as a top tip. Last question, and it's one of those wonderful essay questions again, gifts of 16 marks. And we've got, how far do you agree that, and they'll give you a statement. Introduction should just be a sentence. What is your argument? Overall, how far do you agree? To a great extent, to a limited extent, not at all. Paragraph 1, state how you agree. Give maybe 2 or 3 bits of your own knowledge. End the paragraph by linking back, or as we mentioned earlier, basically saying, what have you proved about the question? How far you agree that such and such a thing? Have you proved that you really agree, or you agree to an extent? Second paragraph, how you disagree. 2 or 3 bits of your own knowledge, and then add, what have you proved? Have you proved that you agree, or that you overall you disagree, or that the disagreement's quite limited? If you have time, you could maybe go for a third disagree paragraph. If not, move on to your conclusion, which is very important for getting top marks. Overall, how far do you agree, and why? Why don't you totally agree, or why don't you really agree very much? Explain and justify your answer. That's the end then of Paper 1, GCSE AQA History. Best of luck with your revision and best of luck with your final exam.